In fact, I find you guilty of trying to take them down with the sham of a trial. Drumhead! Hello and welcome to Enchantment of Eternity's review for Drumhead, which is episode 21 of season 4 of Star Trek: The Next Generation. This video is a part of a series of videos where I review episodes of Star Trek as determined by my user polls. The episode to win my latest user poll for Star Trek: The Next Generation is the 4th season episode, The Drumhead. So, in this episode, a retired admiral from Starfleet comes on board to investigate a possible conspiracy that involves a traitorous Klingon saboteur who was a spy gathering information, and they suspect was responsible for an accident that could have destroyed the Enterprise. However, during the course of the investigation, Picard finds that she is trotting on citizens' rights, and that in fact there was no sabotage, and the incident in engineering was just an accident, but it doesn't bother her as she increases her investigations, and so Picard calls a stop to it, and in response she accuses Picard of being a traitor during an interrogation in which he gets the better of her and proves that her investigations are basically just witch hunts that Starfleet puts a stop to. So this is one of my favorite episodes of Next Generation. It usually makes my top 20 best episodes of sometimes my top 10, but usually my top 20 of Next Generation episodes. It's funny because when I first saw this episode, when I first started watching Star Trek in the early 90s, I didn't think much of it, but of course I was a teenager. I think I was really off-put by Admiral Satie. I found her character really annoying. And I guess I also didn't fully understand or appreciate the message behind this episode or how relevant it is. In fact, when I really started to love this episode and think of it as one of the best Star Trek Next Generation episodes was in the 2000s, shortly after 9/11 and the hysteria that followed, mainly with the Patriot Act and all that sort of things, which were really ordinary citizens' civil rights were really in danger and in the name of security, which is basically what this episode addresses. And so this is one of two Star Trek episodes that I felt really spoke to this, that of course came out before these events happened, but it more speaks to how history tends to repeat itself, which is kind of the point of this episode. That is Picard's speech at the end, that people like Admiral Satie will always be around and they could flourish in circumstances, so they must remain vigilant. In fact, that was the thinking behind the writers who wrote this episode. The concept was brought up by Ronald D. Moore, and it was written by Jerry Taylor, who described this as her favorite script of Next Generation, and I can certainly see why. But their thinking behind it was that this kind of thing does keep repeating itself and could happen again, even in the beautiful, peaceful 24th century Federation. Which of course is something I'm sure Roddenberry would have hated, but this is towards the end of his life when he wasn't very vocal in Star Trek, so they were able to get away with it. But yeah, so this really spoke to me during that era, because I spoke about this before. I was a Iraq War protester. I was very politically active during this time period, and one of my greatest fears were was stuff like the Patriot Act and civil liberties being taken away, and the discrimination, of course, against anyone from Middle Eastern country, and stuff like that. And so the other Star Trek episode I'm speaking of that also spoke to me was, of course, the Deep Space Nine two-parter, Homecoming and Paradise Lost, which is actually eerily like more on point for the 9/11 analogy. Is so accurate. You would think that, like, if it came out after 9/11, you would think it was way too on the nose. But yes, that one. But this one is a bit more sort of vague, where it speaks more into, because it's obvious that when the writers wrote this episode, it was more in direct response to McCarthyism. And that also spoke to me, even though I was not alive in the 60s for McCarthyism, and I hadn't studied it that much. I do remember seeing this movie that I really liked that came out when I was like 11 or 12, called Guilty by Suspicion with Robert De Niro. It's an underrated movie in my opinion. It was about the McCarthy trials. It followed a couple people who worked in Hollywood who were under investigation, how it destroyed their lives. It showed some committing suicide and others like losing their jobs, and the just ruthless witch hunts that McCarthy was responsible for. And so that also spoke to me, because that this episode always reminds me of that movie too. So it was definitely invoking that sort of McCarthyism. And yeah, so it's basically the side of taking away people's liberties and hunting them unnecessarily in the face of fear. Yeah, and in the name of security, but really it's in the face of fear, because people are afraid. And so this leads the question to, so this deeper appreciation made me, or deeper look made me appreciate this episode more. And I love how the Admiral Satie, is not necessarily a villain or a bad guy. In fact, she was shown as quite sort of sympathetic towards the start of the episode. It wasn't until things got worse and worse that she was revealed as someone that needed to be stopped. And I love how Picard takes the position of trusting civil liberties, and they had some really powerful, and I actually think this is the best episode as far as Picard's speeches go. I think I did have this one speech he gave in this episode as my number one favorite Picard speech. Because, yeah, I mean, I think they were the most relevant and the most powerful, and I love that Picard took up the position, and that people like Worf at first were like deceived by Satie and drawn in by it, and Picard like recognized immediately what was going on and how he needed to put a stop to it. Now, as I said, the character of Admiral Satie did really annoy me when I first saw this episode, and it did off-put me. But when I look at it within the more mature, older eye, I can see that this is actually a quite brilliant portrayal. And it shows, like, and this all gets back to what Picard says at the end of the episode, where he says, villains who twirl their mustache are easier to recognize, but those who cloak themselves in good deeds and righteousness are harder to spot. And that's the thing with Admiral Satie, is that she sounds like she's coming from a reasonable position, that there are, because she is correct, there are spies who who do exist and who are trying to destroy the Federation. I laughed because it made me think of in like 2009 or 2010, around that time, I remember arguing with someone over the internet who was a big right-winger Fox News supporter, who was actually like one of these Fox, I think it was like Ann Coulter or some bullshit. One of these Fox News heads wrote this article about how McCarthy was right and supported McCarthy. It's funny because I was watching some commentary and reviews about this episode, and they were saying, yeah, McCarthy was like an evil man, and everyone recognizes that today, but apparently not everyone. And they were trying to support, and actually the articles proposed that McCarthy was right, because it had been proven that there were in fact Russian spies in the U.S. And in some of the areas he was investigating. But no, that doesn't fucking make him right. And this is what I argue with that idiot over the internet. That doesn't matter. It doesn't make him right to take away people's civil liberties, destroy their lives. As I said, people were committing suicide, losing their livelihoods, who are, of course, were completely innocent. No. It absolutely doesn't make it right just because there were, in fact, Russian spies there. It was just, so it's the same with Admiral Satie. Like, the fact that because that Klingon exchange guy was, in fact, a spy for the Romulans. He was working with the Romulans, so she was correct. There were Romulan spies. She's not making this shit up. But she's still wrong. That still doesn't justify her hounding innocent people and taking away people's civil liberties. It doesn't justify it, plain and simple. And this is something that the Deep Space Nine episode, Paradise Lost, got into because, and I'll talk about that episode for a little bit. I already did a review on that, but I still always come back to one of my favorite parts is how Joseph Sisko absolutely refused to give his blood because he's like, I have rights, you have no right to take my blood. And then another terrorist attack happened, and he was like, here you go, here's my blood. I love that because it really speaks to how when people are afraid enough and fear controls them, they're willing to give up their rights, and that's when governments become authoritarianism. That's when authoritarianism and dictatorships flourish and take over. They use that to grab power. And that's what Picard says is to become everly vigilant. And this is exactly what Admiral Satie was trying to do. She was trying to use this to grab power. She was going to increase her investigations. She was going to use this. I do think there was definitely some personal ambition involved in her motivations, for sure. And she was going to use this to increase her power, to increase investigations, to really make a name for herself. But I don't think she was personally as bad as someone as McCarthy, who was all about it was all about personal power. It was all about authority. It was all about making a name for him. He didn't give a fuck. I honestly think he didn't care about communist spies. He didn't give a shit if the people he were hounding in lives he was destroying were innocent or not. He just wanted to make a name for himself. But anyway, that's just my reading on it. So Satie was different in that manner, but I think Satie was similar in regards to the fact that her tactics of using intimidation, especially the way she used her telepath, Sobin, where he right out made up a lie to Tarsus and said, oh, what would you say if I told you that this medical compound that you worked with was directly responsible for destroying the warp core or the accident in engineering, when he knew for a fact that the engineering thing was just an accident, had nothing to do with anything. And as those kind of tactics of sort of fear and suppression, and basically, yeah, I don't think Admiral Satie really gave a shit of whether or not that Tarsus was innocent. I don't think she really, maybe she did believe it because it served her purposes to believe it, but I don't think she ultimately cared, to be honest. And also, but the most telling thing for me, and one of the most powerful parts of this episode, is how when Picard started opposing her and outright said, "I'm going to put a stop to this. What you're doing is wrong," her immediate response to that was to then accuse him of being a traitor. And that is the exact thing of the McCarthyism and the shit that was going on post 9/11 with the Patriot Act. It's the infamous George W. Bush speech, or the quote, which I think is one of the most infamous quotes that history really needs to remember. If you're not with us, you're with the terrorists. It's that kind of mentality that is really dangerous and destructive. And if you think like that Anakin Skywalker made that up when he said, "You're either with me or you're against me," like that's that purposely, that, Revenge of the Sith was completely written as commentary against George W. Bush and the Patriot Act, that whole thing. But that's a whole nother topic. I think I covered one of this. So that line was directly parroting Bush. Didn't come from Anakin. Anyway, but yeah, it's that kind of absolutism mentality. You're with us or against us. And so when Picard was against her, well, you must be with the terrorists then. And so her immediate tactic was to label him a traitor, and so he must be working with the Romulans since he wants to shut down these trials. And you better believe that is the exact same tactics McCarthy used. Whenever anyone opposed what he was doing, they were communists. You're against me trying to find communists? Then you must be a communist. And then he would destroy their lives and destroy their career. And that is the kind of brutal tactics. But of course, in this episode, this is a Star Trek feel-good episode. So Picard actually gets the better of Sati and is able to expose her for who she is. Which I think, if you believe in the Federation or any of the vision that Roddenberry had for the Federation, which I know a lot of Star Trek fans don't, but I do, then you'll see that was a likely outcome. That yes, because in modern times it's easier for these villains to flourish, but in Federation times it was easier for Picard to get the better of her. But yeah, I mean, I love getting back to what Picard says about the easy to see villains who twirl their mustache. I love the fact that Sati does have a point, and you do think that she has good intentions, and that she thinks that she's doing the right thing, but she gets so caught up in trying to find spies and saboteurs everywhere that she doesn't see the damage that she's causing. Another one of my favorite lines in this episode is when Picard was talking to Worf, and they was talking about the Klingon guy, Zhadan, I think his name was, and saying how he admitted his crimes and he'll pay for what he did. And then Worf says, "Well, Tarsus is all but then the same." And Picard's like, "How? Why?" And Worf's like, "Well, he refused to answer the question about his heritage." And I love how Picard gets pissed off, and he's like, "That is not a crime, Worf." Like that is again a powerful statement. He was saying how the I forget what they call it in this episode, the seventh guarantee or something, how that they can refuse to answer the question, how it might incriminate themselves, how that cannot be used against someone to infer someone's guilt, that there's a reason that exists. And I also love how Picard is saying how he keeps reaffirming trying to say that, no, let me remind you that he is innocent until proven guilty. And these people are operating under the assumption that, no, actually he's guilty until we prove his innocence. And that's realistically kind of how it works in modern times, if we're being completely honest. Once prosecutors or law enforcement are convinced someone's guilty, then they're going to go out of their way to prove it, even if it isn't true. And so that's definitely what Satie was doing. Now, let me backtrack a bit and talk about some of the other stuff. Like, we see, again, well, this is kind of a recurring flaw throughout Next Generation, is that we see Troy interrogating Zhadan, and she's not able to figure out what, like, her empathic powers aren't that powerful. Like, she doesn't figure out when he says that he had nothing to do with engineering. She's not able to go like, yeah, he's telling the truth. He had nothing to do with that. But I mean, Sabin does that later on, but still, it's like, I don't know. Good old Troy and her unreliable empathic powers. But, you know, it's also been as Sabin's a full Betazoid, which is implied. Couldn't he, like, read people's minds? Because it's implied what Betazoids can do, but whatever. I thought it was only Troy who could just read people's emotions because she's only half Betazoid, but I don't really care. I think that's too powerful of a tool anyway for a storytelling device anyway. So I like, it's funny because they have Riker serve as Tarsis' trial, which kind of reminds me of Measure of a Man when they made Riker the the prosecutor, but now he's automatically the defense. I don't know, this makes more sense to me that they would have the first officer be automatically assigned to be to defend a crew member. Whereas what they did in Measure of a Man, that seemed plot convenience and ridiculous. Also, this episode was made as a bottle show because they made this for virtually no money. You know, and it's really funny that most of my favorite episodes of Star Trek are bottle shows. It's really funny that when they're forced to go low budget, not rely on special effects and fancy cinematography and luscious locations, that they seem to have to work harder to tell a good story, and they do, and it often results in a better episode. And it's also funny because the producers, the studio, wanted this to be a clip show, and Rick Berman, one of the few good things I can say about him, he absolutely refused. Rick Berman and Michael Piller both said absolutely not, this is going to destroy our trust in the audience, and they're correct. And instead they did this episode, which is amazing and celebrated as one of the best episodes of the show. So it does really show that you don't need big budgets and special effects and fancy things to have an amazing episode. You need good actors, but you already got that in Patrick Stewart. And apparently the other actors, particularly the one who played Admiral Satie, who's also a really good actor, agreed to do this episode for very little money because they didn't have much of a budget. So that also helps. One thing I do love about that final scene, which I think is an amazing scene, when she really tries to take on Picard, is how they had the Admiral who's the head of Starfleet security, and how basically he's just an extra. Like, I love how they have this actor who just sits there and the camera pans to him every once in a while to reassure the audience, ooh, this is an important guy who's watching this trial, so his reaction is important. And then he gets up and walks out, and that's like the big signifier, the holy fuck, like Picard, like Admiral Satie totally lost her shit and everything is, and he realizes, he sees her for what she is. But I love how this was done with an extra, basically, that he was such an important character, yet he had no lines whatsoever. He just, all the actor had to do is sit there and look, and then get up and walk out. And yet it was such a pivotal character for the entire story. I thought that was amazing. But anyway, um, I gotta read Picard's speech. So, hold on. Let me see if I can find it. There are some words I've known since I was a schoolboy. With the first link, the chain is forged, the first speech censured, the first thought forbidden, the first freedom denied, chains us all irrevocably. Those words were uttered by Judge Aaron Satie as wisdom and warning. The first time any man's freedoms is trodden on, we're all damaged. That's fucking amazing. And I think that, yeah, that's my favorite Picard speech, even though he is mostly quoting someone else. But is so powerful and so relevant, even to, especially in this modern circumstances I mentioned, such as the McCarthyism and the post 9/11 fear craze, Patriot Act nonsense. It's really important things to clarify, and one of the most ridiculous statements that I've ever heard, and I think anyone's an idiot who says this. Well, they have, and Worf kind of says it in this episode too. Well, they have nothing to, if they're not guilty, then they have nothing to fear, which is nonsense, because people who aren't guilty can still be falsely accused. They can still be arrested. They certainly do have something to fear, and that is brought up in the scene where Tarsus is like terrified when he's brought up, and Saban like just assumes, and Satie, they both assume that he's guilty just because he's afraid, which is ridiculous. Innocent people can definitely have reason to be nervous and afraid. But anyway, yeah, so that speech was amazing. Also, it's interesting because it shows that Picard is willing to kind of go under the belt by using her father's own words against her when he knows how important her father, because they had these conversations, and she like respects her father and thinks the world of him, and wants to be respectful to his legacy. And that he had to have that pre-prepared, that he probably purposely like was studying his works in order to use something against her. Although Picard does say in the Testament that's words he's known since he was a student, since he was a kid. So this is something he remembered. He didn't necessarily have to go looking for it. But of course, I think he probably did have this pre-prepared, that he knew that this would be the thing that would get to her. So it is kind of an underhanded tactic. But he's absolutely correct. And he's absolutely correct, though, in pointing out that what she's doing is not something her father would approve of, and is, in fact, directly going against his legacy and what he spoke out on. And so he very eloquently, in his Picard way, points that out. And I buy some, I just read a negative review, which I think, of this episode, which I think is nonsense, where they thought it was ridiculous how she lost her shit and completely unraveled just because Picard gave one speech, which I completely disagree with. I totally buy that she would lose her shit over Picard quoting her father, which had been shown throughout the episode how important her father was to her, and how much she respected him, and how much she looked up to him. And so I totally buy that. It is kind of a Perry Mason moment where she loses her shit and exposes herself for being the guilty party, but I buy it. I think it's very believable, especially the way Picard delivers it in his matter-of-fact way. And also, it's kind of like she tried the same tactic with Picard, that she was just trying to undermine him by bringing up the incident with the Borg, which is something that is a very tender topic for him, and trying to blame him for that. And here's the thing: this is basically the tactic that she's using here is basically an ad hominem, and it's something that modern day and historical politicians always employ. Basically, it's to attack the person rather than the subject at hand. Like, if they know they don't have enough evidence or enough of a strong argument, instead of trying to address the argument, which you know you could and will lose because you don't have a strong enough argument, you just attack the person, which is very common, extremely common in politics. It's called attacking your character, which is why ultimately when I'm deciding who to vote for, character is something I never consider because it's bullshit. It's irrelevant fodder to distract you from the issues. You look at the issues, you look at the policies. What policies have they enacted? They're politicians. I don't give a fuck if they slept with their wives or if they were mean to a kid or something. That has nothing to do with the policies. I'm electing these people on policies, not their strength of character. I think the strength, because you can't really judge someone's strength of character. I think that's kind of a bullshit term. But anyway, I'm getting off topic a bit. But the point is this is a tactic. What Admiral Sati is doing is an ad hominem, which basically means you attack the person and not the argument. So she knows that she doesn't really have a strong argument against Picard, but her goal is to take Picard down because he is standing in her way of furthering these investigations. So she immediately says, well, if you don't want these investigations, then you must be a traitor. So she brings up any possible thing that could discredit him. How he violated the Prime Directive, how he was abducted by the Borg and forced to kill their Starfleet. Like, that has nothing to do with fucking Romulans or being a Romulan traitor. Now, she did bring up the whole thing in Data's day with the Romulan spy who he returned to the Romulans, and that does have to do with being with the Romulans. But of course, like, there's an absolutely reasonable explanation for that, because Worf even speaks up and is like, look, he did the only thing we could have done. If he tried to take on the Romulans, that would have, the Enterprise would have been destroyed, and that could have started a war. So it was, even though it's at least relevant to being a Romulan spy, it's a ridiculous. It's that argument has no weight to it, because of course, because leaving, whether he was a spy or not, is the correct action. You don't want to start a war, and you don't want to get your ship destroyed for no goddamn reason, because they were outnumbered. So her arguments are weak. They're just ad hominems. They're basically trying to attack and discredit him, because she knows that she has no real argument against the actual case that she's trying to make. And I love how Picard slams it. And that's the difference between her and Picard. Because what Picard says by quoting her father's words does directly address what she is doing. And and she doesn't really attack her character the way she attacks him. He goes straight for the heart of the matter, the issue. It's amazing just how often that's used in politics and how often people fall for it. I try to ignore it, but anyway. I mean, yeah. So often, because I remember arguing with my family members. We're all Democrats, or, well, I wouldn't call myself a Democrat. They're just the best option other than a bunch of loony clowns. But I remember arguing with them over the Democratic primaries, and my dad kept trying to say, oh, but Biden's such a good guy. He has such a strength of character, and he I believe. I'm like, none of that shit matters. It's who cares? It's bullshit. I look at his policies, and his policy is he supported the Iraq War. He had these draconian crime things he did in the 90s. Now he's changed his mind now. Good for him. Also, look what he did in the Obama administration, how they were weak against the Republicans. I would rather go with someone who has a stronger character like Elizabeth Warren or Bernie Sanders or someone like that. But anyway, I'm gotten too much into politics. I'm sure all the right wingers are thumbing down my video and leave politics out of Star Trek, which is the most ridiculous comment. That's the most ignorant comment I've ever heard, because Star Trek is stemmed in politics, especially episodes like this one. It's like it's the whole fucking point of it is to be political, so leave politics out of Star Trek is the dumbest, most ignorant. I laugh. It's so ridiculous that it's funny. But anyway, sorry, especially if you're tuning in to review for this episode, you should expect it to get political. I'm sorry. But anyway, God, this is such a good episode. And Picard, this is one of Patrick Stewart's best performances. I will say that speech that I quoted, I remember going to a quiz night, one night just with some friends, and it was a lot. It was like a movie-themed quiz night, television movie. But towards the end, they had an actor come up and it's like, so this actor's going to recite something, and you're going to have to guess who said it. I think they say which actor, this actor who said this quote is most known for two roles. What was the other role that he played? And so the actor came up and recited this, and as soon as I heard it, I was like, holy shit, it's the speech from Drumhead. But of course, so the correct answer was Professor X, because you had to guess Patrick Stewart's other famous role other than the one that was said, which is kind of a tricky way to put it. Anyway, so yeah, I thought that was good, because it also showed just how much this episode is sort of seeped into pop culture. And because a lot of people did get that right. And yeah, I was actually surprised to hear that. But anyway, my rating for Drumhead out of 10 is a 10, the best. I think this is an amazing episode, amazing performance by Patrick Stewart. Yeah, and just overall, everything about this episode is amazing. So that's it for my review of the Drumhead. Be sure to check out my channel as I cover many more videos on Star Trek. I will not leave politics out of Star Trek. Well, that's funny. As well as covering other shows like The Expanse, Better Call Saul, and more. So be sure to subscribe so you can keep up with all that. And thanks a lot for watching.